At the beginning of this month, on March the 2nd to be exact, in order to impose the toughest ever sanctions on North Korea, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted its resolution, UNSCR 2270. And we want to discuss how things have been unfolding ever since then and where we are heading from here. All coming up right here in this program, Upfront.
On March 2nd, UN Security Council meeting was held at UN headquarters in New York. It was to carry out a vote on a new resolution on North Korea, which has conducted a nuclear test and a missile launch in January, despite the rising concerns from the international community. And as a result, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2270. The newly adopted resolution restricts North Korean cargo, whether by land, sea, or air. The resolution includes mandatory inspection of all cargo entering and leaving the North. And it requires member states to forbid any North Korean aircraft from overflying, taking off, or landing in its territory. This newly adopted sanctions also forbids entry of suspected North Korean flagged vessels. These restrictions are expected to inflict serious damage to North Korean foreign trade. Imposing sectoral sanctions on the North has been one of the most notable changes in the newly adopted resolution. It includes limiting and, in some instances, banning outright exports from the North of certain resources like coal and iron. And such limitation will bring about a significant damage to the North Korean economy, which has been highly dependent on mineral exports. Financial restrictions are also expected to cripple North Korean economy. UN member states have agreed to ban financial institutions from opening new branches of North Korean banks. And it also ordered countries to close all North Korean banks and terminate all banking relationships within 90 days. It has cut off all the funding sources for North Korea from overseas. International community has shown a strong will to fully implement the strongest set of sanctions on North Korea.
The government will spearhead efforts to fully implement the newly adopted UN Security Council resolution by working closely with all member states of the Security Council. We will further strengthen international cooperation so that North Korea will abandon its nuclear program in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible manner.
A comprehensive discussion on North Korean nuclear issue is expected to take place during the 4th Nuclear Security Summit. Each participating country is expected to reach a general consensus on imposing stronger sanctions against the North. In response to such stronger sanctions, North Korea has carried out stronger provocative actions, including the launch of short-range missiles and mentioning of a nuclear strike on the Korean peninsula. The toughest ever sanctions on North Korea are expected to squeeze the North more strongly in the near future. And the global society has paid its attention to the future response from the North.
Well, for today's discussion, we have in studio Ambassador Shin Dong-ik, the newly appointed president of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And our North Korean expert, Professor Lankov of Kookmin University, joining us here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Ambassador and Professor, let's talk about overall perhaps the point that our viewers who are watching from overseas may be most interested in. That is, we have had so many different UNSCR resolutions so far, right? And this is the 4th one, and a lot of people, a lot of audience may be wondering what the difference is this time, how this is different from the previous sanctions. What are some of the key differences in terms of what's included in UNSCR 2270? What can we say?
as you mentioned already, this is the strongest sanction resolution than ever since the resolution against Iraq,
Right.
when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. So that is a kind of a military sanction, but this is a non-military economic sanction. It has a very strong teeth and coercive measures. So 4 areas I'd like to point out. The first one is the financial area.
All right.
It's North Korea should close all branches overseas, and all the financial transactions between North Korea and foreign countries will be limited.
Okay.
And second area is the sectoral ban, the ban of the export of mostly the minerals, natural resources, coal, and also the iron, and also there's a prohibition of supply of the aviation fuel.
Okay.
This is another area, particularly new ones, additional ones. And inspection of the North Korean vessels and interdict North Korean vessels entry to the major ports.
Right.
This is a very effective the sanction measure. Lastly, the addition of the long list of the sanctions, entities and individual. So new additional list is 16 individual and 12 entities. So far until if we add up all the list is 60 North Korean agencies and the government authorities and individual, the persons, now the sanctions. That means they cannot travel and their assets are frozen as of March 2nd.
Okay.
So this is kind of the international obligation. So Article 25 of the UN Charter, all the Security Council resolution should be respected and abided by all the members states.
Of the United Nations.
This is kind of international law,
Right.
legally binding one.
Your observation, Professor
Yes,
Lankov?
and I would say I would agree with Ambassador because it's the toughest resolution ever in regard to North Korea. And what is very important and new is a ban on export of the minerals.
Okay.
The export of titanium, gold, vanadium, rare earth minerals is banned unconditionally.
I see.
The export of iron ore and coal is theoretically banned, but with a huge loophole, which I believe is quite deliberate. So it depends if a particular export operation is considered to be unrelated to the nuclear and missile developments, it's legal.
The highest level sanctions this time, but you still seem to be seeing lots of loopholes there, and sometimes you may be critical, but at the same time you're recognizing the level of sanction itself is very high. Ambassador Shin, then, we understand some of the P5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, in negotiation of deal, they were talking about the mineral exports that affect the livelihood of the people and so on. So that what they meant by that was the export of coals and so on. Is that how it?
Yeah, it's clearly that the resolution expressed some the concern of the negative impact on the general populations. So there should be exceptions, exemptions to a humanitarian purpose. So sanction committee will consider any request from a certain country to allow the export to the coals or any the prohibited items to North Korea. There's no exception about WMD related, as Professor Lankov mentioned.
Right.
But the normal trade will be considered whether it will be used by the general population. So sanction committee will consider whether it can be categorized for the use of the general population,
right.
the humanitarian purpose. That's the very important criteria. How whether this coal or natural mineral resources can be exported from North Korea, from the outside.
Okay. Then from very technical but basic perspective here, you're saying the financial transactions will be strictly limited. Then how will North Korea get paid when they sell coals in order to maintain the livelihood of the people. How does it work?
There'll be several ways. For example, that's kind of the trade, barter trade. Maybe in return, North Korea can other commodities instead of any dangerous items, for example. And also cash can be brought into cash. But in the previous resolution 2094 and the new resolution, strictly control and tracked any illicit transfer of the bulk cash. So North Koreans is not free carrying all the bulk cash, the large amount of the volume of the dollars into the North Korea, but very limited way they can exchange of that currency, hard currency.
Okay, at this particular point of the program, we'll be connecting with our experts from overseas, and we have various experts joining us here through the connections. And let me start with the first question to our guests. First of all, about the impact of this sanction that's being required by the UNSCR, United Nations Security Council resolution. What will be the actual impact? There have been so many different kind of perspectives and views about how much difference it will make on North Korea this time. But I'd like to ask our guests in terms of what you see, how powerful, how significant this action will be.
Well, I think it was long overdue to have this kind of a very strong resolution. Whether it will have any impact on North Korea remains to be seen. It's one thing to agree to have this kind of punishment, but then it's another for all the countries to enforce it. In the past, we've had some fairly strict sanctions, but the Chinese have clearly not enforced them. This time it appears that Beijing is a little bit more upset with the North Koreans, but the question is for how long will that last? So I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm not sure it will get to change their behavior, but at least will show them that there are serious consequences to their actions.
Okay. Any additional perspective on the same question here, the impact of the sanctions, particularly North Korea, as well as its effectiveness? Okay.
I think it is going to be very hard because we know that the sanction resolution that passed this time is the harshest in history. It has the most strict sanction on North Korea. But people also know that the effect or the effectiveness of the sanction regime depends on whether China will loyally implement the sanction. I just came back from Beijing last night, and in my conversations with Chinese policy wonks, with government officials and analysts, they do intend to implement the sanction resolution in the foreseeable future. But I did not get a clear sense that they will loyally implement the sanction resolution permanently, which means that in the future, if the North Koreans' domestic politics becomes unstable because of the sanction, or the harsh sanction on North Korea is pushing North Korea to the other side of the game, China is very likely to loosen its implementation of the sanctions.
Right. I'm thinking about the Iran's case, previous United sanction case on Iran. At that time, United States and EU were playing major roles. And here, I'd like to invite the European perspective this time about this set of sanctions on North Korea. From the European perspective, what kind of roles and what kind of points, observation can we expect on this particular case?
I think the EU is going to be faced with a problem regarding the sanctions. First of all, does it have its own autonomous sanctions in addition to the UN sanctions? The answer is yes. The EU has already published a list of North Korean companies and individuals who are forbidden from having exchange with Europe. So there is a further list. The real choice beyond that is implementing the third-party controls, which the US has committed to. That's a very tricky issue given the magnitude of trade inside, for example, European ports and by third country companies. This is an area where the difference between EU countries and others is that if EU countries adopt these checks, they will actually have to implement them, whereas you can look for previous sanctions, many countries have not even reported on the implementation of sanctions, and many of them might even be unable to do so. So this is a strong issue given the magnitude of foreign trade for Europe to implement. But I guess the pendulum is swinging towards a better check on sanctions than previously.
Okay, this question goes to Professor Rudiger Frank. You have mentioned before that perhaps the strong pressure on North Korea is not going to really work with, at least with a short time period. And you've been saying that North Korea is not going to give up their system and the things that they value as a result of this sanction and other sanctions in the past as they've been shown so far. What's your take on this? Are you changing your perspective this time regarding this particular UNSCR resolution, or are you still keeping the same perspective? If so, why?
Well, we might not know every detail about North Korea, but what we do understand is the system. We understand it quite well. Politically, it is a dictatorship with a strong ideology, and economically, it's a state socialist system with a few elements of a market economy. I have lived in such a system myself, so I believe that I know how it works. For a long time, North Korea has been quite extreme, to be honest. There was almost no money that played a role. Everything was distributed by the state. But this has changed long ago. This change started in the late 1990s. Money now does play a strong role in North Korea's society again. Individuals do have individual alternative options for upward social mobility. And the system has to fight with a constant loss of legitimacy through corruption, and also because of the previously more or less equal distribution of wealth has made room for a growing diversification in North Korea's society. You know about the rising middle class, etc.
Okay, great, thank you. And we'll have these guests connected once again in the later part of our program here. But thank you for now with great comments. Now we want to move on to what was actually happening during the time of negotiation over the UNSCR. And more than anyone, perhaps Ambassador Shin is the best person we can have on this program, because you were Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs, and you were engaged, particularly at the time of January, I suppose, following the nuclear test by North Korea. Tell us a little bit more about, tell us about your observation about how the P5 and concerned countries negotiated to come up with this deal. Tell us a little bit of this story.
So I was in UN, United Nations, for a long time. So between 2013 and 14, we are the member of the Security Council. So we have the good experience how to make a negotiation deal with the other members. So after the January 6th, North Korea tested nuclear weapons, we prepared the draft resolution together with the United States. And I visited United Nations 2 times, and we negotiated with other members. And China is the main player with the United States. So because they are P5 and who has more direct interest in the Far East and the Korean Peninsula. So our main target is China. How to persuade the China to support our draft resolutions. But it's a hard job, as Professor Lankov mentioned. The initial response is very soft and very negative. But as time goes by, that's critical moment is February 5th and 7th.
Yes.
February 5th, the President Xi Jinping, he made a call to my president, Park Geun-hye, and followed by the telephone call to the President Obama. That might be turning point because 1 or 2 days before, North Korea, they announced they're going to test another long-range missiles called the satellite. And 2 days after 7th of February, North Korea really, they fired, tested the long-range missile. Since then, so many things changed. So even China was very upset about the further provocation. So the Uda Wei, the Chinese six-party talks negotiator, visiting the Pyongyang. But during his visit, North Korea announced another testing the long-range missiles. So it might cause some change in the Chinese the strategic calculations.
I see.
So this is a time to put more pressure to North Korean leader. So that's the only way to change the North Korea's the bad habit and change the course back to the negotiation table, so-called six-party talks. And Korean side, my president showed strong determinations, closing the Kaesong Industrial Park. Is more important than anything. Is put real pressure, the cut on all the cash flow to Kaesong, and the anti-ballistic missile system. So THAAD is another issue. We announced to start the discussions, consultation with the United States.
So many things have been happening for the last about more than 2 months. And in addition to Professor Lankov's speculation about the United States' strategic move, North Korea's their own actions also had made a big difference.
I probably should mention, I would agree with Ambassador Shin because it was very important. Because I also had a feeling that changes began after the missile launch. So obviously it might be a combination of the American pressure and the missile launch, which was done in a very offensive way. Let's not forget, North Korea over the last few years under Kim Jong-un, due to some reasons I do not quite understand, essentially keeps slapping China in face.
That's true.
Because, the strange escape of the Moranbon girls group in December. We can continue. There have been many cases when North Korean side, with no kind of clear reasons, humiliated China.
Professor Lankov, still the question remains, though, after the January nuclear test, right? South Koreans were quite surprised by Chinese insistence on dialogue. And that was a surprise to us because for a long time, as you mentioned, China has been kind of been made disappointed by North Korea. And we thought the whole year last year and before, Korea's president worked very hard to make China move closer toward us. And then all of a sudden in January, what we saw was a disappointment in a way. Can you explain what happened in January after following the nuclear test, why China acted that way, which surprised a lot of people?
I was not very surprised in that case. I was surprised when they changed their line and became tough. I was not surprised when they were soft.
I see.
Because obviously at some point, I would say in August or September last year, China decided to become more supportive of North Korea, largely because...
When was this?
I would say August or September.
Last year?
October, yes. Liu Yunshan, the highest ever Chinese official ever sent to Kim Jong-un's court, visited Pyongyang. And even after the Moranbon incident, when performance was cancelled with very short notice, they were very careful. They essentially censored all references to this incident from the Chinese internet, not to create some kind of public outrage about North Korea. So they wanted better relations with North Korea. Why? First, China has ever been and will be divided by two requirements, two kind of goals. On one hand, China wants a stable and divided Korea. China wants status quo.
That we know, clearly.
On the other hand, China does not want tensions and provocations by North Korea, and China definitely does not want nuclear North Korea. These two goals are not really compatible. So China sort of oscillates. Sometimes they go one way, another. It's a very kind of zigzag
policy. And we have to be able to expect that in a way.
Yes, and it will continue because right now China is tough, but I would not bet on China being tough, say, later this year.
Okay, great point on that. And let's go back to the process of negotiation here. Maybe I could have asked Ambassador Shin, but perhaps the Russian perspective here. Russia became, at the very last moment, in a way, according to our observation, a very important player. And we noticed that Russia might have felt that they've been left out in terms of negotiation. Has there been some kind of mistake on our side in terms of
problem is, I would not overestimate the significance on Russia, the kind of importance of the Korean issue to the Russian side.
So you believe that some of us might have been underestimating?
No, probably overestimating. Right now, Russia just decided to follow China and United States.
I see, right.
Because if you look at the Russian economic interests in North Korea, there's a small exception of Rajin Hassan project, which is frankly not that bad, not that big by the...
Right, it hasn't even started.
Yes, it does exist, but not more.
Right.
Russian economic interests in North Korea are essentially non-existent. Few people realize that the trade between Russia and North Korea is 60 times, I repeat, 60 times less than trade between China and North Korea.
Interesting.
If you take into account unofficial trade, the difference will be less dramatic, but still very large. Unlike China, Russia does not trade with North Korea.
Right, right. Interesting. We have to now switch back to our focus back to China here. And we've been talking about the new mechanism put in the agreement or resolution to make sure that everyone will cooperate, all the countries will cooperate this time. But we still notice that China has kept, according to Professor Lankov's prediction and as he expects, China will maintain its policy of emphasizing the dialogue and cooperation together with the sanctions, right?
Right.
And now, what do we see in terms of seeking China's cooperation with regard to this particular resolution, UNSCR 2270? Can you assure us in a way that this time China will definitely be on board? Do we have reasons to believe that? And what are they?
So we like to respect the commitment and the promise made by the Chinese government several times. So the spokesperson and also the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi they'll strictly implement all the resolutions. And some signs of the Chinese side, they banned the entry of the Chinese, North Korean vessels, which is on the list of the sanctions and the new resolution.
They have to close down North Korean banks in China. Are they doing that?
Yes, already the banks, North Korean banks, we are in the list. Maybe they closed already. But the problem is the North Korea now changed the names of the companies or the business. So we call it the front companies. So we have to trace all the illicit activities by the North Korea. But you mentioned about the Chinese attitude. So as Professor Lankov very well explained, the Chinese, their principles of foreign policy toward the Korean Peninsula remain same. Firstly, denuclearization, so nuclear-free Korean Peninsula.
Right.
And second is maintaining peace and stability. And third one is addressing this issue through the diplomacy and negotiation, not the military ways. So they like to preserve, maintain Korean Peninsula as stable, because China, they explain several times, they have also some economic problems. Once North Korea has some very negative situations, frankly, maybe the political change.
Right.
So it causes serious problems.
That's not what China wants.
Yes,
definitely.
That's why they like to maintain. But this time, for the resolution itself, so United States already imposed the bilateral individual sanction. So it will be some serious impact to the Chinese, the companies and entities. So, but in comparing with the bilateral sanctions, the UN sanctions is much milder than the bilateral ones. So there's no reason for China to avoid any implementation of the relevant elements of the resolution.
Problem is financial sanctions are different because what essentially Americans are doing, they say, if any bank deals with North Korea, Americans will never deal with this bank. And because United States are so central for the international financial system, for any bank to be denied access to the American partners is a death sentence.
That's secondary boycott.
Yes.
Secondary boycott.
This labor is significantly less efficient because, as I have said, major importers of the North Korean laborers are Russia and China.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that the actual number is higher than 60,000. Because I just know Russian and Chinese statistics, which indicates it's higher. And there are other countries too. But outside China and Russia, other countries, again the same question. You are a big company. Yes, cheap North Korean workers is great. But what if you get in trouble with the United States, which is a major market?
I see.
So they're using their central position in the economic and especially financial system.
Okay, makes perfect sense.
South Korean government has unveiled unilateral sanctions on North Korea, right after the UN Security Council adopted its new resolution on North Korea on March 2nd. It is to effectively implement the newly suggested UN Security Council resolution.
우리 정부는
As a party directly involved in North Korea's nuclear and missile issue, the government has played a leading role in strengthening international sanctions against North Korea. The government will continuously cooperate with the international community to change North Korea by strengthening our own sanctions against the country.
The government has decided to take all possible steps to press the North by bolstering financial sanctions, as well as sanctions on any shipping, exports, or imports related to the North. It has also designated 30 North Korean and foreign organizations and 40 individuals related to the development of weapons of mass destruction subject to an asset freeze and a ban on financial and property transactions with any South Korean entity. With North Korean restaurants around the world serving as a source of foreign currency, the government appealed to its citizens not to visit them. The government has especially shown strong will to ban the entry of any foreign vessels that have traveled through North Korea. Along with the strengthened sanctions, Najin Hasan Project, which has been a logistics cooperation project among Seoul, Pyongyang, and Moscow, has been put on hold indefinitely. Washington has also announced its unilateral sanctions on North Korea. As part of an effort to fully implement the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress last month, U.S. President Barack Obama issued an executive order imposing fresh sanctions on North Korea. The sanctions include the comprehensive ban on all trading related with mineral and overseas labor exportation. It also proposes penalties on banks and firms in third countries that aid the North Korean regime, known widely as secondary boycott. After announcing its unilateral sanctions against Pyongyang, Seoul and Washington held high-level talks to discuss North Korea's sanctions on March 21st. The two countries agreed to fully implement the newly announced UN resolution, as well as effectively make use of its own unilateral sanctions in order to impose stronger pressure on the North. However, dynamics surrounding the Korean peninsula have been fluctuating, along with the opposition raised by China and Russia, who have been key players in North Korea's sanctions. They have agreed that the North's provocative actions deserve a stern punishment. But at the same time, they have opposed the implementation of unilateral sanctions by individual countries. It is because of the possibility of unilateral sanctions to deepen isolation of the regime and make it harder to have a dialogue with North Korea. Neighboring countries have taken different stances on North Korean sanctions after the adoption of the new UN Security Council resolution. Situations surrounding the Korean peninsula have been walking a tightrope between sanctions and cooperation.
And here, let's move on to South Korea's sanction, unilateral or bilateral sanctions here. Once again, Ambassador Shin was, I believe, involved in coordinating South Korean ministries and the overall government position in coming up with the sanctions, a set of sanctions, as the Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs. How did it come about? What happened? Has there been any difficulties? I mean, before I ask that question, I should ask you perhaps the overall description of the South Korea sanctions. What does it look like?
So as I mentioned earlier, this is a complementing measures. Firstly, I called the meeting of inter-ministerial meeting in March 3rd, the same day after we Security Council adopted resolution.
Right.
So 14 ministries and agencies were participating in our meeting. Firstly, strengthen the sanction measures against the DPRK. So based on the existing ones. And secondly, we need to prepare kind of a country implementation report to the UN Security Council.
Is this
within
report
90
about each individual countries, how they're
Yes.
implementing?
So
So
within-
about China, it will be very important.
Yes, within 90 days, 3 months' time, each member state its obligation to submit that report, how they're planning to implementations in the very feasible way. So based on the Security Council, the resolutions, we checked one by one how we can further strengthen the sanction measures internally and toward against the DPRK. The first one is financial ones and also trade. So we already cut all the relations, the business and trade relations. The best example is Kaesong Industrial Park. So no more maybe support North Korea's economy. And Najin Sambong, we elaborate later.
Right.
And it's a small one, it's a symbolic thing, advisory note to the South Korean tourists not to go to North Korean restaurants.
Right, overseas.
Overseas in China and Southeast Asian countries. That whole the incomes, revenue from those restaurants is reach about $10 million.
Wow.
So there's a news already in the media.
Right.
Some North Korean restaurant is about to close
I see.
because they don't have any the incomes from the activities.
Okay.
And secondly is maritime interdictions. So we prohibit the the vessels and ships who visited North Korean port in within the 180 days, 6 months. So once they visit North Korea, they cannot come to South Korea and even China, and Japan and other countries. So nobody wants to visit the North Korean port.
Sort of that's a maritime style of secondary boycott.
Secondary
I suppose.
boycott,
Right,
it's
right.
maritime section.
Okay.
And the list of the sanctions, individuals, entities. So all 40 individuals and 30 entities. Entity means companies or any authorities and state agencies. So including the individual is very famous, Hwang Byung-seo and Kim Young-chol.
Right, right.
The entities is the 39호실, the 39 chambers. This is a critical area how to impose the further additional measures. So it's complementing and reinforcing together with the Security Council resolutions.
Talking about one of the points that Ambassador Shin discussed, Najin area related. Korea, South Korea, and Russia. Back in 2013, President Park Geun-hye and Putin came to an agreement to develop this Najin-Hasan joint project, where the Najin and Hasan will be connected through railways, and then from Najin there will be, the maritime route that will connect to South Korea. So it will be a trilateral cooperation project, and I suppose this will have to be discontinued as a result of this one. What do you see as in terms of impact on Russia and South Korea?
First of all, I don't think it's going to be discontinued because it can be done without South Korea's participation. It's essentially about shipping coal from Russian coal mines through a North Korean port to a third country, not necessarily South Korea. So there might be and there will be some replacement.
But
so
that practice will continue on, though, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Right. So not to South Korea, but they can still.
Absolutely. And if you look at the text of the resolution 2270, it's explicit. Point 29A, if I remember correctly, it's explicit that Rajin Hasan project would continue. It was quite explicit.
Okay.
So even without South Korean participation, the coal probably will be shipped to other customers.
So South Korea is the only one that's losing?
Yes.
Okay.
It's no. Of course, South Korea was a major customer, so it will damage the project. It will make its economic. It will make it less profitable, definitely.
And Japan is not going to be the country that
Of course,
will,
no,
accept
of
the
course
vessels.
not.
Right.
China maybe, because for China it might make sense. Maybe some other customers. So there will be some customers without South Korea, but it will damage the profitability of the project. Nonetheless, I think it will survive and will continue to operate.
So that means actually Russia cares greatly about this.
If you look at the scale of the Russian economy, it's a small project.
Okay.
It's a bit
But
like...
still it survived in the resolution. That's interesting.
But
I mean, the fact that it survived in the resolution.
yeah, because
makes it
actually
very
Russia
interesting.
took 24 hours to make adjustment, and there were just only two adjustments, actually three adjustments, but they all were very small, and they all were meant to shelter some Russian entities and bureaucratic agencies and companies from impact of the sanctions. But once again, Rajin Hassan project is very big for North Korea. It's small for South Korea, it's small for Russia. Let's not forget that we are talking about major economies.
I see.
So for them, for the Russian economy, it's good to have it, and it was government duty to protect it, because we are talking, well, maybe less than $500 million investment total, even less, so not big.
Okay, let's move on to a bigger picture here. We're getting closer to the end of our discussion here. Ambassador Shin, I'd like to ask you this question that a lot of South Koreans may be having in their minds. For a long time, extended period, like 57 days at least, from the nuclear test until the UNSCR resolution coming out, a lot of South Koreans were wondering whether we are going back to a new phase of a new Cold War with South Korea and United States on one hand, and then China and Russia on the other, the world being divided in this part of the world particularly. Was that concern legitimate at that time before the adoption of the resolution? And then is that concern still, does it make sense after adoption of the resolution? What do you see here?
Before going into that issues, I'd like to respond briefly about Professor Lankov's comment on the Najin Sunbong. So this is a long tradition and practice in the Security Council on the issue of the Korean Peninsula. The China and United States firstly negotiate the draft resolution, and then when we prepare the kind of common the text, so Russian side comment on that. So this time also, this is the same practice, and Russian side comment 2 or 3 points. That one part is the exception of the Najin Sunbong area. Second one is the allow some exceptions of the humanitarian use of the aviation fuel, and the transit, the places. That's kind of humanitarian issues. So we welcome and accept the Russian proposal to amend, allow the export Russian coal through the Najin to the third country. That's another area.
Okay.
So we have no problems working closely with Russia on that North Korean issues in the Security Council. But the only remaining issues is together with implementing of the resolution, what will be the next step? So the future course of our dialogue. We like to resume their six-party talks to induce North Korea to give up their nuclear weapon program, CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible destructions. That's common goals of the other members, 5 countries. So until six-party talk will start, my president proposed, why not? 5 members. We have to get together and prepare the common positions. So that's initial idea.
Okay, about the future prospect for Korean Peninsula, what's going to happen ahead as a result of these resolutions and so on, we'll be reconnecting with our experts joining us from overseas. Okay, guests, my first question here. First of all, we've been hearing about this issue about THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System, that is to be installed by the United States but being opposed by China. What is your view and perspective over the dispute regarding this particular missile defense system? What do you see in terms of United States' position and in the change of it, and also China's persistent position against this issue? Is this a real one, and what kind of difference does it really make?
Well, we know that China and Russia have both stated that they are against the deployment of THAAD. And the reason that they cited is that THAAD is going to be a threat to their national security. Well, based on the technical details, they will argue that THAAD is not really effective in terms of North Korean provocation. And especially coming to the radar capability of THAAD system, the Chinese believe that the THAAD will be a dire threat to their national security. So the question in China on THAAD is not that whether THAAD will be a serious punishment for North Korea. The question in China instead is whether THAAD is some sort of punishment that South Korea is pursuing because China is not doing enough on North Korea. So in a way, THAAD has become an issue between Beijing and Seoul, rather than an issue, at least in the Chinese perception, an issue between Pyongyang and Seoul.
And any other views on this particular question? I'd like to invite other guests to join in here.
Well, I think the THAAD system is very important, and it's important not just to defend Korea, but to be able to defend against an attack by the North Koreans against the United States or against Japan. What people in Korea need to understand is that the U.S. bases in Japan are absolutely vital to the defense of the ROK. So you want to have a system and an integrated air defense system that allows you to monitor and respond not just to a North Korean attack on the South, but also against U.S. bases in Korea in Japan, or in Guam, or in Hawaii, or on the mainland U.S. And having the THAAD system there, I think, helps to have a layered air defense capability, which provides you with better warning and a better ability to respond, not only to protect the ROK, but to protect your ally, the United States, and to protect U.S. bases in Japan that are critical to the defense of the ROK.
And the question goes to Professor Rudiger Frank here. You have experienced all these things that has been happening in the former Eastern Germany and the former Soviet Union and so on. Based on your experience and observation, what do you see in terms of what's happening in North Korea? With this kind of outside pressure, will we get to see actually North Korea eventually improving their interaction with outside world, that just as other former communist countries have done so? Please tell us your position on that one.
In principle, I think so, yes. That's because of the structure of the North Korean economy, which is in principle more outward oriented, and because of the geopolitical situation of North Korea, which makes it very difficult to live in an isolated way. I also know specifically from many talks I had with North Koreans that Pyongyang is also interested in such a cooperation, of course, as long as their sovereignty is not threatened. The precondition would be that both sides, that is North Korea and the West, develop some respect for each other and understanding of each other's priorities, which, as we all know, is of course very, very difficult if we consider what has happened so far. I'm afraid the West, or we, if you include South Korea, is as unwilling to compromise as North Korea is. Therefore, I believe a realistic policy for the moment would be to accept the differences in opinion and try to move forward on less controversial issues.
And the last question is regarding North Korea's reaction to the world community's joint action this time. North Korea is cranking up the level of their rhetoric in terms of threatening outside world, in terms of what they're going to do in reaction to this United Nations sanctions and the world community's action here. How much should we be concerned in terms of their threats, particularly nuclear threats, Is this real? And from outside perspective, we have our own views here, but from outside perspective, how seriously are you taking North Korea's rhetorics this time?
I don't think a replica of what North Korea did with Syria pre-2007 would be possible today. At the time, what the North Koreans succeeded in doing was exporting and assembling in Syria literally a carbon copy of the Yongbyon nuclear plant, which is in North Korea. That would be impossible today, given the extent to which traffic from North Korea is monitored. What I think remains is the possibility of either hiding and exporting nuclear material itself or spare parts of ballistic missiles, for example. And that is what we are dealing with also through the sanction resolution.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your perspective and views being shared with us. Thank you. And we are now joining once again in the studio with our guests who will continue to share with us their views. We should have a more official closing our discussion here. Final words goes to Ambassador Shin here. What's the overall prospect and the future road ahead that you're looking here at this point as a wrap-up, and very briefly as well?
Professor Lankov already illustrated, but I'm not academician, so a little bit cautious. But our ultimate goal is denuclearization. It's an achievable goal, we believe, because if North Korea will provoke again, so as they already warned another testing of a nuclear warhead or the long-range ballistic missiles, North Korean leadership will face further serious consequences for the isolations, the stronger additional measures, sanction measures. So my president stressed, if North Korean leadership will continue to develop nuclear weapons again, it will lead to a possible end of its regime. So in the other way around, so Gaddafi and the leadership of Iraq they face the same destiny. So until then, we like to ask the North Korean leadership to change their calculations, strategic minds. So that's the best way. So total isolation, putting more pressures until they feel the real pain. This is only way to exit from the very dire situation of the economy. The economic whole situation is getting worse and deteriorating now. So they should be felt the pain. So this is the lead way how North Korean leadership change their course and come to the dialogue table. Denuclearization, we believe, one day, I like to mention this way, but we don't know, nobody knows how the situation will change. So we'll continue to take out the basic policy of denuclearization.
So South Korean government is keeping its hope up together with the United States, I suppose.
In addition, Russia is now a responsible working group in the framework of the Sixth Party to deal with the peace mechanism. So that's the best, very realistic way to discuss on the peace treaty.
Obviously, as our viewers joining from all around the world can notice, this debate can go on for quite some time, but we have to wrap up our discussion. But as we air this program, there's a nuclear summit taking place in Washington, D.C., so I suppose you will have to update the facts coming out from there together with our discussion here. But we hope certainly our viewers have learned a lot about this very important issue. And certainly next time when we discuss other issues that matters for Korea as well as the world, you should join us again. And until then, this has been Kim Byung-ju. Goodbye.